Madam Secretary, regardless of where he ranked in the order of advisors, it is undisputed that a significant number of your emails were to or from a Sidney Blumenthal. Now, he did not work for the State Department. He didn't work for the U.S. government at all. He wanted to work for the State Department, but the White House said no to him. Do you recall who specifically at the White House rejected Sidney Blumenthal?
No, I do not.
After he was turned down for a job at the State Department by the White House, he went to work where?
I think he had a number of consulting contracts with different entities.
Well, if he had a number of them, do you recall any of them?
I know that he did some work for my husband.
Well, he worked for the Clinton Foundation.
That's correct.
Okay. He worked for Media Matters.
I'm sure he did.
He worked for Correct the Record.
I'm sure he did.
When you were asked about Sidney Blumenthal, you said he was an old friend who sent you unsolicited emails, which you on in some instances because you wanted to hear from people outside what you called the bubble. We will ignore for a second whether or not Sidney Blumenthal is outside the bubble, but I do want to ask you about a couple of those other comments, because what you left out was that he was an old friend who knew absolutely nothing about Libya, was critical of President Obama and others that you work with, loved to send you political and image advice, had business interests in Libya, which he not only alerted you to, but solicited your help for. And you often forwarded his emails, but usually only after you redacted out any identifiers so nobody knew where the information was coming from. What does the word unsolicited mean to you?
It means that I did not ask him to send me the information that he sent me. And as I have previously stated, some of it I found interesting, some of it I did not, some of it I forwarded, some of it I did not. I did not know anything about any business interests. I thought that just as I said previously, newspaper articles, journalists, of which he is one, a former journalist, had some interesting insights, and so we took them on board and evaluated them, and some were helpful and others were not.
We're going to get to all the points you just made, but I want to start with your public comment that these emails were unsolicited. You wrote to him, "Another keeper, thanks and please keep them coming. Greetings from Kabul and thanks for keeping this stuff coming. Any other info about it? Question mark. What are you hearing now? Question mark. Got it. We'll follow up tomorrow. Anything else to convey? Question mark." Now, it's interesting because that was the very email where Mr. Blumenthal was asking you to intervene on behalf of a business deal that he was pursuing in Libya. What did you mean by what are you hearing now?
I have no idea, Congressman. They started out unsolicited, and as I said, some were of interest. I passed them on, and some were not. And so he continued to provide me information that was made available to him.
I don't want to parse words, and I don't want to be hyper-technical, because it's not a huge point, but it is an important point. You didn't say they started off unsolicited. You said they were. You said they were unsolicited.
Well, they were unsolicited, but obviously I did respond to some of them.
Well,
and I'm sure that encouraged him.
Anything else to convey? What are you hearing now? I'm going to Paris tomorrow night. We'll meet with TNC leaders, so this and additional info useful. Still don't have electricity or BlackBerry coverage post-Irene, so I've had to resort to my new iPad. Let me know if you received this. We'll talk about the new iPad in a little bit. Here's another one. This report is in part a response to your questions. That's an email from him to you. This report is in part a response to your questions. There'll be further information in the next day. If you're the one asking him for information, how does that square with the definition of unsolicited?
I said it began that way, Mr. Chairman, and I will add that both Chris Stevens and Gene Kretz found some of the information interesting, far more than I could, because they knew some of the characters who were being mentioned, and they were the ones, the kind of persons with the expertise that I asked to evaluate to see whether there was any useful information.
We're going to get to that in a second. Now, before you give Mr. Blumenthal too much credit, you agree he didn't write a single one of those cables or memos he sent you.
I'm sorry, what?
He didn't write a single one of those cables or memos.
I don't know who wrote them. He's the one who sent them to me.
Would you be surprised to know not a single one of those was from him?
I don't know where he got the information that he was sending to me.
Did you ask? You're sending me very specific, detailed intelligence. What is your source? That seems to me like a pretty good question.
I did learn later that he was talking to or sharing information from former American intelligence officials.
By the name of? Who wrote those cables?
I don't recall. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
You had his information passed on to others, but at least on one occasion you asked Ms. Abedine, can you print without any identifiers? Why would you want his name removed?
Because I thought that it would be more important to just look at the substance and to make a determination as to whether or not there was anything to it.
Well, don't people have a right to know the source of the information so they can determine credibility?
But he wasn't, as you just said, the source of the information.
But you didn't know that, Madam Secretary, and that's what you just said.
No, Mr. Chairman. I said that I knew that he didn't have the sources to provide that information. I knew he was getting it from somewhere else. He knew a lot of journalists, he knew others in Washington. It could have been a variety of people.
Well, if you're going to determine credibility, don't you want to know the source?
Well, it wasn't credibility so much as trying to follow the threads that were mentioned about individuals. And as I already stated, some of it was useful and some of it was not.
Well, did the president know that Mr. Blumenthal was advising you?
He wasn't advising me. And,
Did he know
Mr. Chairman,
that he was your most prolific emailer that we have found on the subjects of Libya and Benghazi?
That's because I didn't do most of my work
That's
about
fair.
Libya on
I'm
email.
not challenging that, Madam Secretary. I am not challenging that. All I'm telling you is the documents show he was your most prolific on Libya and Benghazi. And my question to you is, did the president, the same White House that said you can't handle him, can't hire him, did he know that he was advising you?
He was not advising me, and I have no reason to have ever mentioned that or know that the president knew that.
All right, I want to draw your attention to an email about Libya from Mr. Blumenthal to you, dated April 2011. It will be Exhibit 67. And this is informative. Should we pass on, and in parentheticals, unidentified to the White House? If you were going to pass something on to the White House, why would you take off the identifiers?
Because it was important to evaluate the information, and from a lot of intelligence that I have certainly reviewed over the years, you often don't have the source of the intelligence. You look at the intelligence and you try to determine whether or not it is credible, whether it can be followed up on.
Well, I'm going to accept the fact that you and I come from different backgrounds, because I can tell you that an unsourced comment could never be uttered in any courtroom. You have to have the right.
We're not talking about courtrooms, Mr. Chairman.
No,
we're talking about intelligence.
No, we're talking about credibility and the ability to assess who a source is and whether or not that source has ever been to Libya, knows anything about Libya, or has business interest in Libya, all of which would be important if you were going to determine the credibility, which I think is why you probably took his information off of what you sent to the White House. But here's another possible explanation that may give us a sense of why maybe the White House didn't want you to hire him in the first place. In one email, he wrote this about the President's Secretary of Defense. I infer Gates' problem is losing an internal debate. Tyler, and by the way, Tyler is Tyler Drumheller. That's who actually authored the cables that you got from Mr. Blumenthal. Tyler knows him and says he's a mean, vicious little, I'm not going to say the word, but he did. This is an email from Blumenthal to you about the President's Secretary of Defense. And here's another Blumenthal email to you about President's National Security Advisor. Frankly, Tom Donilon's babbling rhetoric about narratives on a phone briefing of reporters on March the 10th has inspired derision among serious foreign policy analysts, both here and abroad. And here's another one from what you say is your old friend Sidney Blumenthal. This is a quote from him. I would say Obama, and by the way, he left the president part out. I would say Obama appears to be intent on seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. He and his political cronies in the White House in Chicago are, to say the least, unenthusiastic about regime change in Libya. Obama's lukewarm and self-contradicting statements have produced what is, at least for the moment, operational paralysis. I think that may give us a better understanding of why the White House may have told you you cannot hire him. Blumenthal could not get hired by our government, didn't pass any background check at all, had no role with our government, had never been to Libya, had no expertise in Libya, was critical of the president and others that you worked with, shared polling data with you on the intervention in Libya, gave you political advice on how to take credit for Libya, all the while working for the Clinton Foundation and some pseudo-news entities. And, Madam Secretary, he had unfettered access to you. And he used that access, at least on one occasion, to ask you to intervene on behalf of a business venture. Do you recall that?
You know, Mr. Chairman, if you don't have unkind things privately, I congratulate you. But from my perspective,
I'd like to think I'd correct them.
I don't know what this line of questioning does to help us get to the bottom of the deaths of 4 Americans.
I'll be happy to help you understand that, Madam Secretary.
But I want to reiterate what I said to Congresswoman Sanchez. These were originally unsolicited. You've just said that perhaps the main, if not the exclusive author, was a former intelligence agent for our country who rose to the highest levels of the CIA and who was given credit for being one of the very few who pointed out that the intelligence used by the Bush administration to go to war in Iraq was wrong. So I think that, you know, the sharing of information from an old friend that I did not take at face value, that I sent on to those who were experts, is something that makes sense, but it was certainly not in any way the primary source of or the predominant understanding that we had of what was going on in Libya and what we needed to be doing.
Well, Madam Secretary, I'm out of time, and we'll pick this back up the next round, but I'll go ahead and let you know ahead of time why it's relevant. It's relevant because our ambassador was asked to read and respond to Sidney Blumenthal's drivel. It was sent to him to read and react to, in some instances on the very same day he was asking for security. So I think it is eminently fair to ask why Sidney Blumenthal had unfettered access to you, Madam Secretary, with whatever he wanted to talk about, and there's not a single solitary email to or from you, to or from Ambassador Stevens. I think that Madam Secretary, before we broke, there was a question asked that I thought was a fair question, which is, why was I talking about Mr. Blumenthal's emails? I do think that's a fair question. I think it's an equally fair question to ask why you were reading Mr. Blumenthal's emails. I think both are fair, so I want to go to June of 2012, which is an interesting time period to look at. It started. Charlene Lamb was an employee of the State Department, and she sent an email which you may be familiar with. It's at tab 56. I'm not going to read it, but it's at tab 56, where she described Benghazi as a soft target, attacks on Americans not staffed adequately. It's a very haunting email to read. It was actually 3 months to the day when our 4 fellow citizens were killed, and that's on June the 7th, 2012. Also on June the 7th of 2012, your Deputy Chief of Staff, Mr. Jake Sullivan, is emailing Ambassador Stevens, asking the ambassador to look at a memo Sidney Blumenthal sent you. And in fact, Mr. Sullivan writes to the ambassador, Chris, checking in with you on this report, any reactions? All right, that's on exactly the same day that I believe our ambassador's papers were accepted in Libya. It's the day after an IED attack on our compound, and Chris Stevens is being asked to read and react to an email by Sidney Blumenthal from your deputy chief of staff. This is what he's writing on the 7th. This is after he's been turned down on a request for more security. This is our ambassador. Appreciate you giving this proposal consideration, even if the conclusion was not favorable for us. We'd be interested in pursuing the other avenue you suggest, high-threat trained agents. Best, Chris. So I've got this contrast in my mind. An ambassador is newly in place. It's a day after an attack on our facility. Your deputy chief of staff is sending him an email from Sidney Blumenthal asking him to take time, read and react to it. And then, to the best of my recollection, that's forwarded to you. So help us understand how Sidney Blumenthal had that kind of access to you, Madam Secretary, but the ambassador did not.
Mr. Chairman, because I think that your question does help to clarify matters. Chris Stevens emailed regularly with Jake Sullivan, one of my closest aides in the State Department. He could have emailed to Mr. Sullivan knowing that it would have been immediately responded to on any issue that was of concern to him, and he did not raise issues about security on that day or other days. And I think it's important to recognize that when an ambassador is at post overseas, especially one as experienced a diplomat as Chris Stevens, he knows where to pull the levers, where to go for information, where to register concerns. And I think he did exactly as one might have expected. He dealt with security issues through dealing with the security professionals who were the ones making the assessments. And I think that Ambassador Stevens understood completely that that's where the experts were, and that's where anything he requested or anything he was questioning should be directed.
Speaking of experts, who is Victoria Newland?
A very experienced diplomat. She served as our ambassador to NATO, appointed by President George W. Bush. She served as one of the advisors as a Foreign Service officer delegated to the White House for Vice President Cheney. She served as the for the State Department during my tenure, and she is currently the Assistant Secretary for Europe under Secretary Kerry.
She wrote this to the ambassador on June the 13th, 2012. That is a week after the facility was attacked. It is only a handful of days after he was turned down on a request, specific request, for more security. Chris, I know you have your hands full, but we'd like your advice about public messaging on the spate of violence in Libya over the past 10 days. So she's asking him for help with public messaging. Jake Sullivan, which is the other half of the question that I don't think we got to. I understand that Chris Stevens was a rule follower. I understand that. I've got no qualms. My question was actually not why Chris Stevens didn't contact you, but why did Jake Sullivan send Chris Stevens a Sidney Blumenthal email to read and react to on the day after the facility was attacked? The same day he was denied a request for more security, and instead of email traffic back and forth about security, it's read and react to a Blumenthal email.
Well, I think any ambassador, if one were sitting before the committee, would say that they handled a lot of incoming information and requests. Some of it was about what was happening in country. Some of it was about what was happening back in the United States. And Chris felt strongly that the United States needed to remain in and committed to Libya. So he was concerned that there might be a feeling on the part of some, either in the State Department or elsewhere in the government, that we shouldn't be in Libya. And he was adamantly in favor of us staying in Libya. So part of what the discussion with him and and Jake Sullivan and others was, how do we best convey the stakes the United States has in staying involved in Libya would be. And I thought that was, very much in keeping with both his assessment and his experience.
Well, I appreciate your perspective, Madam Secretary. Let me share with you my perspective. And if you need to take a time to read a note, I'm happy to pause.
No, I'm just being reminded, which I think is important, that, remember, Chris spent the vast majority of his time in Tripoli, not in Benghazi. So a lot of what he was looking at is how you deal with not only those in authority positions in Libya who were based in Tripoli at that time, but also representatives of other governments and the like. And I think it is fair to say that any time you're trying to figure out what's the best argument to make, especially if you're someone like Chris Stevens trying to put together and make the best argument about why the United States should remain committed to Libya and others as well, he's going to engage in conversations about that.
Well, with respect, Madam Secretary, no matter what city he was in Libya, having to stop and provide public messaging advice to your press shop and having to read and respond to an email sent by Sidney Blumenthal, it doesn't matter what town you're in. He needed security help. He didn't need help messaging the violence. He needed help actually with the violence. You have said several times this morning that you had people and processes in place. And I want to ask you about an email that was sent to you by another one of your aides, Ms. Uma Abedin. That would be exhibit number 70 in your folder. She emailed you that the Libyan people needed medicine, gasoline, diesel, and milk. Do you know how long it took you to respond to that email?
I responded to it very quickly.
4 minutes. My question, and I think it's a fair one, is the Libyan people had their needs responded to directly by you in 4 minutes. And there is no record of our security folks ever even making it to your inbox. So if you had people and processes in place for security, did you not also have people and processes in place for medicine, gasoline, diesel, milk?
Mr. Chairman, I've said it before. I will say it again. I'll say it as many times as is necessary to respond. Chris Stevens communicated regularly with the members of my staff. He did not raise security with the members of my staff. I communicated with him about certain issues. He did not raise security with me. He raised security with the security professionals. Now, I know that's not the answer you want to hear because it's being asked in many different ways by committee members. But those are the facts, Mr. Chairman. Ambassadors in the field are engaged in many different tasks. They are basically our chief representative of the President of the United States. So they deal with everything from, foreign aid to security to dealing with the personal requests for visas that come from people in the country they are assigned to. And Chris Stevens had regular contact with members of my staff, and he did not raise security issues. Now, some of it may have been because, despite what was implied earlier, there was a good back and forth about security, and many of the requests that came from Embassy Tripoli, both for Tripoli and for Benghazi, were acted on affirmatively. Others were not. That is what an ambassador, especially a diplomat as experienced as Chris Stevens, would expect, that it would be unlikely to be able to get every one of your requests immediately answered positively. So, yes, he had regular contact with my aides. He did not raise security with me, and the security questions and requests were handled by the security professionals.
Madam Secretary, with all due respect, those are two separate issues. Who Chris Stevens had access to is one issue. Who had access to you and for what is another issue. Because you have said you had people and processes in place. You also have people and processes in place for people who want to send you meaningless political advice. You also have people and processes in place for people who want to inquire about milk and diesel fuel and gasoline. You also have people and processes in place for people who want to provide insults towards folks you work with in the administration. All of that made it directly into your inbox, Madam Secretary. That is my question. My question is, how did you decide when to invoke a people and process and who just got to come straight to you? Because it looked like certain things got straight to your inbox and the request for more security did not. And while you're answering that, I want to inform and instruct why I'm asking it. You have mentioned the ARB on a number of occasions again today. This was not the first ARB. We had one after Kenya and Tanzania. And that ARB could not have been more specific. The Secretary of State should personally review the security situation of our embassy facilities. That ARB put the responsibility squarely on you. So with respect to that previous ARB recommendation, and in contrast, what did make your inbox versus what did not, did you personally review our security situation as the previous ARB required?
Well, let me see if I can answer the many parts of your question, Mr. Chairman. Yes, personal email came to my personal account. Work-related email did as well. And I also relied on a number of my aides and staff members, as well as experienced Foreign Service officers and civil servants, who were similarly engaged in gathering information and sharing it. And as I said, and I will repeat, Chris Stevens communicated with a number of people that I worked with on a daily basis in the State Department. So far as I know, he did not raise any issue of security with any of those people. He raised it where he knew it would be properly addressed. If he had raised it with me, I would be here telling you he had. He did not. And so I think it's important to try to separate out the various elements of your question, Mr. Chairman, and I will do my best to continue to try to answer your questions. But I have said before, and I will repeat again, Sid Blumenthal was not my advisor, official or unofficial, about Libya. He was not involved in any of the meetings, conversations, other efforts to obtain information in order to act on it. On occasion, I did forward what he sent me to make sure that it was in the mix. So if it was useful, it could be put to use. And I believe in response to the email you pointed out originally from Ambassador Stevens, he actually said it rang true and it was worth looking into. So I think it's important that we point out the fact that Mr. Blumenthal was not my advisor. He was not an official of the United States government. He was not passing on official information. He, like a number of my friends who would hand me a newspaper article, would buttonhole me at a reception and say, what about this or what about that? We're trying to be helpful. Some of it was, a lot of it wasn't.
Chair will now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
American diplomats would be safer today. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Madam Secretary, I couldn't help but think when he was using the $20 million figure, that's two more ISIS fighters that we could have paid for. I refuse to put a price tag on the lives of 4 Americans. Your figure of $20 million is wrong, Mr. Cummings, and that's not what the State Department told us. But I don't care what the figure is. There is no price tag when it comes to justice for 4 people who gave their lives for this country. Madam Secretary, with respect to the ARB, I want to ask you this. If you were investigating Benghazi or what happened in Benghazi, and there was an author of an email 3 months to the day from when our 4 fellow Americans were killed, the author of the email says anti-American demonstration, looking for Americans to attack, game changer, soft target, no continuity, the cost to continue to do business there may become challenging. Would you want to talk to the author of that email if you were investigating Benghazi?
The Accountability Review Board had full run of the State Department to talk to anyone they chose to talk to. It's my understanding they conducted more than 100 interviews, and they were well aware, as their report reflects, of the dangerous situation in Libya.
I don't want to interrupt you. That actually was not my question. My question is, would you want to talk to that person? Not whether or not the ARB did, because the ARB actually did talk to that person. My question is, wouldn't you want to talk to that person if you were investigating Benghazi?
Well,
I promise it is not a trick question. The answer is yes. You would want to talk to the person who authored that email.
And as you just said, Mr. Chairman, the ARB did.
Yes, and the co-chair of the ARB called your chief of staff and told the author of that email not to go to Congress. That's my point. My point is the ARB did some good things. That's why our first two hearings were on making sure the recommendations by the ARB were actually implemented. But when the author of that email is going to be brought before Congress and one of the co-chairs calls your chief of staff and says, I don't think that that witness is going to be a good witness, Madam Secretary, with all due respect, she's a fact witness. Whether she's good or bad, the author of that email has a right for Congress to question them. I mean, that's not even a close question. So somebody can be a good person, and I have no doubt that Mr. Mullen and Mr. Pickering both are. But this is also what I don't doubt. I don't doubt that that phone call was made to Ms. Mills saying, don't send Charlene Lamb before Congress. She's not going to make a good witness. And I don't doubt that there's not a transcript from any of the ARB interviews. And you may say, well, why does that matter? If you're going to write a report, and you want to write a report with specificity and particularity, you have to cite the transcript. And I can't tell you a single question that was asked of a single ARB witness because there is no transcript. So my point is not that the ARB did a bad job or a good job. My point is from a standpoint of a serious investigation, it was an inadequate job. And I want to hopefully prove that to you. There used to be a stack up there when Mr. Smith was with us about all the previous investigations that Congress and the ARB had done. Did any of those previous congressional investigations or the ARB have access to your emails?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, the witness you were referring to did appear before Congress.
That was not my point.
But your implication was that witness was stopped from going to Congress. In fact, that did not happen, Mr. Chairman.
No, she definitely came.
Yeah.
No, that's not my implication. My implication is the co-chair of what you call an independent accountability review board was calling someone he was supposed to be investigating to say, please don't send that witness to Congress. They're not going to show up well. That's my point. My point is, how can you consider that to be? I mean,
well,
have you ever heard of a judge calling the DA or the defense attorney and say, don't call that witness?
I really don't care what you all say about me. It doesn't bother me a bit. I do care a lot about what you're implying about Admiral Mullen, and I will not sit here and hear that.
Well,
Admiral Mullen served this country with great distinction. He served the Department with great distinction in being the co-chair of the Accountability Review Board. And I think his work speaks for itself.
Well,
and I'm sorry that the important work that was done by that board is held in such low regard by some members of this committee, and I deeply regret it.
Are you doubting that he placed the phone call? Is that the purpose?
I know nothing about the phone call.
Well, I do, because he testified before another congressional committee. He admits it was a mistake, Madam Secretary. I don't know why you can't.
Well,
he admits it was a mistake to call and say, don't send a fact witness before a congressional committee.
Well, I think that
It doesn't mean he's a bad person. It just means that when you hold up the ARB as independent and your chief of staff picked most of the folks on it, Patrick Kennedy had a role in picking some of the folks on the ARB, despite the fact that some people think Patrick Kennedy may have also been involved in approving or not approving. If you need to read a note from your lawyer, you're welcome to, Madam Secretary.
No, it's just hard to sit here listening to the comments you're making about someone that I consider to be a great American. If he said he made a mistake, that's even more proof of what a fine gentleman he is and what a great public servant he's been. It doesn't in any way, what you're saying, impugn his service for 40 years and certainly not his service on the Accountability Review Board. I can't help it, Mr. Chairman, that you all don't like the findings of the Accountability Review Board.
We had
I can't
two
help
hearings.
it that you don't like the findings of all the other
hearings.
congressional committees.
We had 2 hearings where we did nothing but discuss the implementation of the ARB findings, Madam Secretary. So with all due respect, we've had more hearings about the ARB findings than we have with you. So don't tell me that we don't care about the ARB. We had 2 hearings. My point is this. The ARB nor the previous congressional investigations had access to your emails, did they?
I don't know what they had access to. I know that during the time I was at the State Department, there was certainly a great effort to respond to your predecessor, Congressman Iss's inquiries, and many thousands of pages of information was conveyed to the Congress. And I know that the State Department has worked diligently and persistently to try to respond to the many requests that it has received. And I think that given the pressure and stress of business they've been under, they have performed as well as they could. So you will be getting, and in fact the entire world will be getting, all of my emails, because they're all going to be public, and you will be able to read them along with everybody else.
Madam Secretary, that actually was not my question. My question was whether or not the previous congressional committees and ARB had access to your emails. That was my question.
90 to 95% of my work-related emails were in the state system. If they wanted to see them, they would certainly have been able to do so.
You know what? That is maybe the 10th time you have cited that figure today.
It is.
And I have not heard anyone other than you ever cite that figure. Who told you that 90 to 95% of your emails were in the State Department system? Who told you that?
We learned that from the State Department in their analysis of the emails that were already on the system. We were trying to help them close some gaps that they had.
Can you provide me with a name? Because when I asked the State Department about 10 days ago, what's the source of that figure, they shrugged their shoulders.
Well, you can look for the state.gov address, and they certainly pop up. And
right, and the Inspector General report, Madam Secretary, the Inspector General report, which you can't argue by perfect analogy, but you can certainly extrapolate, the Inspector General report found that less than 1% of State Department emails, record emails, were captured. So they give a number of less than 1%, and you give a number of 90%.
Well, I don't know what you're referring to. I can only speak about my emails, my work-related emails.
Well, let's talk about your work-related emails. We asked for them last year, and the State Department gave us 8. If they had 90% of yours, why did we only get 8?
Well, I don't know initially what you asked for, but I know that they tried to be responsive. 90 to 95% of them were on state.gov. I understand that the committee broadened the scope of their requests, and I think that in response, the State Department has been trying to provide what you have requested. In the meantime, they're going through the process of making all of my emails public.
You think our first request, there were only 8 emails responsive to our first request?
I can't speak to it. I believe your first request was for Benghazi, and I believe that the State Department did a diligent search. Then I believe you expanded it to Libya and weapons and maybe a few other terms, and I believe they conducted
our jurisdiction hasn't grown, Madam Secretary. Our jurisdiction is the same thing it was. Let me ask you this. You say that you turned over everything. I don't get a chance to watch you a lot on television, but when I see you are interviewed, you make a point of saying, I turned over everything.
All my work-related emails.
How do you know that?
I know that because there was an exhaustive search done under the supervision of my attorneys, and that is exactly the outcome. We turned over every work-related email. In fact, as somebody referred to earlier, we turned over too many. In the State Department and the National Archives said there were 1,246 out of the 30,000 plus that they've already determined did not need to be turned over.
And you have a really good group of attorneys, which makes me wonder how they missed 15 of them.
Well, if you're talking about Mr. Blumenthal, which I assume you are, he had some that I didn't have, and I had some that he didn't have, and I was under no obligation to make any of his emails available unless I decided they were work-related. And the ones that I decided that were work-related, I forwarded to the state.gov accounts of the people with whom I worked.
Madam Secretary, is there any question that the 15 that James Cole turned over to us were work-related? There was no ambiguity about that. They were work-related.
Well, they were from a personal friend, not any official government, not any government official, and I determined on the basis of looking at them what I thought was work-related and what wasn't, and some I didn't even have time to read, Mr. Chairman.
Are you telling me the 15? Are you telling me that the 15? I will tell the gentle lady from California that I'm going to take a little bit extra time, just like everybody else has, and we can either do it this round. We can either do it this round, or we can do it next round.
May I make a simple inquiry about how many more minutes the chairman plans?
The fewer the interruptions, the quicker I can get done. I'll put it to you that way.
Okay.
How's that?
I'm just
the 15.
Mindful of the time.
My question to you on the 15 is: did your lawyers find them and decide that they weren't work-related, or did they not find them?
Well, I don't know why he had emails I didn't, and I don't know why apparently I had emails he didn't. And all I can tell you is that I turned over every work email in my possession.
All right, I'm going to make two more observations, and then we're going to call it a night. The first observation that I would make is that when you speak to the public, you say, "I turned over everything." That's, for the most part, a direct quote. When you talk to the public, you say, "I turned over everything." When you talk to the court, you say, "While I do not know what information may be responsive for purposes of this lawsuit, I have directed that all my emails on clintonemail.com in my custody that were or potentially were federal records be provided to the Department of State, and on information and belief that was done." Why the different explanation depending on who you're talking to?
Well, one is a shorthand, Mr. Chairman.
Well, why not just tell the court, "I turned over everything"?
Well, you know how lawyers are. They use more words perhaps than they need.
Trust me, I know that, and they charge you for every one of them.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that, Mr. Chairman, and the clock is ticking.
Well, one more, and I'll pay Mr. Kendall's fee for the last question.
Oh, I don't think you want to do that, Mr. Chairman.
I probably can't do it. You see my point, though? You're very definitive when you're talking to the American people that you turned over everything.
That's right.
But there are those kind of lawyerly fudge words when you're talking to court on information and belief.
Well,
and the reality is, even tonight, you cannot tell us that you turned over everything because you didn't think you missed the 15.
Well, I didn't have them. I turned over everything I had. Everything I had has
Which
been turned
means the
over
system
to the
you
State
had
Department.
somehow missed those 15.
Well,
last question on your system. Mr. Cummings said that your email arrangement was inappropriate. I think the president may have said it was a mistake. Said that it was a mistake. My question to you, Madam Secretary, is was it a mistake for the 4 years that you had that email arrangement? Was it a mistake for the almost 2 years that you kept the public record to yourself, or has it manifest itself as a mistake in just the last 6 months?
Well, since I believed that all of my work-related emails to .gov accounts were being captured and preserved, it wasn't until I was asked to help the State Department to fill in what they saw as some record-keeping gaps, not just with me, but with others. I did the best I could during those 4 years and thought that everything that I was emailing that was work-related was being preserved.
If you can find a source for the 90 to 95%, I would be grateful for it, and we would probably have fewer questions. If there is a source that you can provide that 90 to 95% were on the State Department system, then I'll know that I need to ask the State Department what took them so long. Because I'm just telling you, Madam Secretary, I got 8 emails the first time I asked, and now I've got over 1,500. So there's some disconnect there.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that is a fair question. And I'm not at the State Department any longer, but I do want to defend them. They are under the most extraordinary pressure to answer congressional inquiries. I saw a figure recently that FOIA requests have jumped something like 300%. They don't have the resources. They don't have the personnel. They take their responsibility of reading every single line, and as Ranking Member Cummings reminded us, having to redact personal information, personnel information, obviously they take it very seriously. I think they're doing the best they can, and I know that they've tried to be responsive to you and to the many other requests that have come their way.
Well, Madam Secretary, on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for your patience and for your willingness to come. And you have been willing to come in the past, as I noted in my opening, and we appreciate it. And with that, we will be adjourned.